Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for this morning's webinar. My name's Kath Crowther, I'm the Regional Director for the CLA in the East and your chair for today. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to mention some of the issues the CLA has been working on recently. Firstly, can I remind you of the wealth of information and guidance which is available on the CLA web pages, including specific pages relating to COVID-19. This includes guidance to help members to meet the government's conditions on reopening tourism businesses and includes guidance on risk assessments. Members also can access free advice from our specialist advisors in the regions and in London. Please do get in touch with the regional office if there's anything we can do to help you. That's what we're here for. Those inquiries also help feed into our very regular meetings that we're having with government departments and help us establish a lobbying position on different matters. The recent cut in VAT from 20% to 5% for tourism, which we initially proposed in April in our Reopening the Rural Economy paper, was a big CLA win. Whilst COVID has taken up a lot of our time over the last few months, we've also been working hard on lots of other topics. Future of farming, support mechanisms have all been high on the agenda. The Ag Bill is at the committee stage of the House of Lords, and we continue to work with peers and MPs on amendments, including ensuring a fair transition away from direct payments. We have submitted our ELM consultation response, and that consultation closes on the 31st of July. And if you'd like to see a copy of the response, it is available on the CLA website. We've also been working on the Environment Bill ahead of that being reintroduced, and we're currently drafting our response to DEFRA's tree strategy. Last week, we launched a new policy paper on simplifying the planning system and how that could stimulate economic growth in rural areas. You are able to see more details of that on the CLA website if you would like to. Moving on to today's webinar, whilst there's a huge amount of interest in carbon and how we get to net zero, there tends to be a lack of information and many members don't know where to start. Before I introduce our speakers, I should remind you that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the webinar pages of the CLA website within about 24 hours. Please do feel free to ask questions at any time during the presentations. Do that by using the Q&A button on the black band at the bottom of your screen. We'll then attempt to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentations. Our lineup today will start with Alice Ritchie, who leads on climate change and water at the CLA. Alice will talk about what net zero means for landowners and farmers, tools for carbon accounting and how to use these. Ed Hutley from Stratton Parker will talk through what you can do with a carbon audit and potential income streams. And Oliver McIntyre, National Agriculture Strategy Manager at Barclays, will talk about the risks if this is ignored and the future opportunities. Thank you again for joining. I will now hand over to Alice Ritchie, who is CLA Land Use and Policy Advisor.
Great, thank you, Kath. Good morning, everybody. Just sort my screen out. Cool, sorry. Right, so I am going to talk with you all today about net zero, climate change, carbon accounting, all of my favourite topics. So I will run through some of the kind of the basics here, really. I think a bit of background context, some of the basics of carbon accounting, the online tools that you can use to get started, and also a few emissions reduction strategies for farmers. So seeing as you're already all sitting at your computers this morning, what I'm hoping you'll all do is, once you finish this webinar, obviously, jump on some of these online websites and have a look at some of the resources I'm going to show to you and get started straight away on your own carbon account. I am really conscious that these topics are extremely detailed. It's quite easy to get bogged down in some of the detail, and also there's a lot of different sort of nuances and elements of it that are just not quite that straightforward. So while I'm going to keep this presentation relatively high level, given the numbers of people that are attending and things, and so I'll try and keep it relatively high level. But if there are more detailed questions you want to ask, or there's sort of something specific you'd really like me to get into, you're very welcome to chuck it up in the Q&A section in the box, and and hopefully we can get to it in the Q&A section, because yeah, really happy to answer sort of slightly more technical questions, but I will try my best not to delve too far into them during this presentation. So for a bit of context, in 2016 the UK signed the Paris Agreement, as I'm sure everyone will know, and that pledged to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. The UK then became the first major economy to pass net zero emissions into legislation. So that means essentially across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, we have to bring our emissions down as far as possible, but we've got to make up the balance by increasing the amount of activities that we do that take carbon out of the atmosphere. So this might include tree planting, peatland restoration, but also technologies that capture and store carbon. So the important part of this for us is that the net zero goal covers all greenhouse gases. So the main ones we're concerned with are carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide. So this will become sort of more important as we keep looking at agriculture. After the UK announced net zero legislation, a huge number of companies, associations, organisations, local councils, all sorts, signed up to their own net zero pledges too, all with slightly different dates maybe in mind. Some went for 2050, some have gone for 2040, some have gone for 2030. There's a few that I've popped up there that are sort of part of the wider food supply chain. But yeah, it was a sort of very encouraging sign that a lot of people got on board with this and started looking at ways within their own organisations that they could start moving towards net zero. The other very important organisation to consider in this space is the Committee on Climate Change. They make recommendations to the government on emissions reductions targets, but also do annual reports on progress. They've done a few different reports on land use, agriculture, forestry, and they published a progress report just a month ago, demonstrating how the UK is not on track at the moment to meeting the net zero targets, how we haven't put the policies in place that we need, and that unfortunately we're not on track at this stage to meet net zero. It's probably worth mentioning at this point too that the net zero target isn't just a political thing. I mean, it's in legislation, so the government is legally obligated to get there, but it's also a scientific goal. It was a goal that was established based on science. We know that we need to get to net zero emissions if we want to reach the targets in the Paris Agreement and keep global warming below 2 degrees and preferably to 1.5, although that is looking less and less likely, unfortunately. So this is sort of the UK's way of doing its part. So the progress report that I mentioned earlier that the Committee on Climate Change published last month, it focused on how we're not currently meeting our climate change targets, but how we need to use the recovery from COVID-19 to get there. So obviously we've had some quite big changes. We've had Brexit and we've had coronavirus. So it's sort of understandable that it's been more difficult than normal to meet some of our climate change targets. But they outlined ways that we can harness this recovery and use it to get those targets. Agriculture, unfortunately, was specifically called out for failing to make massive changes. You can see in these charts here from last month's report that other sectors are slowly decarbonising, but agriculture has remained more or less static since about 2009. So it is quite an important part of the whole picture, we sort of do need to acknowledge that as these other sectors come down, the proportion of emissions from agriculture will start to increase. But another really important aspect of this is that these charts are based on sort of national inventory data. So they are relatively simple assumptions and modelling by way of measurement, and a lot of individual changes that might be happening on farms, for example, any increases in soil carbon and things like that, might not necessarily show up in these charts. So this is kind of where carbon accounting comes in. I think we as an industry need to start pulling together our own data, pulling together our own evidence, our own case studies, all of that kind of thing, and start shifting the narrative a wee bit to show that, you know, maybe these numbers and these charts haven't gone down, but actually there is a whole lot of work going on behind the scenes that's helping us get there. So yeah, this is really where carbon accounting comes into it. This slide I just sort of thought I'd pop in to show a wee bit, give a wee bit more context around how the Committee on Climate Change view the world, really. They've got this ideal landscape, I suppose, where we've reduced agricultural land by around 22% through a combination of productivity improvements, I think they call it sustainable intensification, and diet change to reduce the amount of agricultural land that we have and use that freed up land to plant more trees and restore peatland. It's still quite important to realise that the majority of rural land will still be grassland and rough grazing, so nobody's proposing covering the entire country in trees. But yeah, it's all kind of, it's big picture stuff, and this is sort of how they see things looking over the next 30 years moving up to 2050. So I do find these charts, you sort of look at them and think, it's really hard to know what that actually means for an individual farmer. It's hard to know how to put it all into perspective. So again, this is where carbon accounting really comes into it to help you understand what you're working with, what's happening on your own farm, and where you can make improvements. So a few more, getting sort of more into the on-farm stuff. Emissions from agriculture, I'm sure plenty of you already know all of this. They're made up of roughly 60% methane, which largely comes from ruminant livestock digestion and slurry and manure management. 30% of it is nitrous oxide, and this mainly comes from the production of and application of artificial fertilizers. And the remainder is CO2, largely from farm transport and energy use. This is, as you can imagine, a pretty different picture to other sectors. So yeah, we're talking majority methane and nitrous oxide. Most other sectors will be sort of 90 to 100% CO2. So it's really important that we acknowledge that that's a big difference. The Committee on Climate Change has, the UK government has, they've acknowledged that CO2 is the priority. We need to get that to net zero, and that we need to get it to zero preferably. And that there's a really big difference between taking fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them for fuel and in turning it into carbon dioxide than the biological emissions that are caused, that are produced through agriculture. And there's, other elements to it. I think they estimate if we didn't have artificial fertilizers, over 50% of the world couldn't be fed. So there is an acknowledgement that to produce food is to produce emissions, but agriculture, land use, all is part of the wider picture of how we can get the entire economy to net zero. So a carbon account, at its most basic, measures all of those emissions on an individual farm. So you'd measure your methane from any livestock, maybe nitrous oxide from your fertilizer use, carbon dioxide, and then you'd balance them against the woodland that you might have, the soil carbon, anything, agroforestry, all of that kind of stuff, balance it all together and work out what your carbon footprint on your farm looks like. So how do you measure them? We recommend 2 different online tools. So I'll sort of run through them in a wee bit more detail, and then the next slides show you a bit of a sort of an idea of what they actually look like. So the Cool Farm tool is the first one. It is an online calculator. It is free for farmers and it's relatively user-friendly, although I won't pretend that these aren't quite a lot of work and do involve a bit of sort of sitting at the computer time, which I know that nobody loves. But they can, if you sort of put the effort in, they can give you some really valuable information back. So the Cool Farm tool calculates emissions per unit of product. So we'd be talking the carbon footprint of a litre of milk or a kilogram of meat or a tonne of grain or something like that. So the good thing about measuring your emissions per unit of product is that you are then able to benchmark against others who are producing the same product. So this can be quite an important way to benchmark yourself, measure against other people, and figure out sort of where you sit and where you might be able to start thinking about making improvements. So also this tool, this is always a question that I get, this tool does also measure your soil carbon sequestration. So it does all of your greenhouse gas emissions and your soil carbon sequestration. So the other good thing about this tool, if you're working out your emissions per unit of product, you only need to have on hand the data that is relevant to that particular product, which you'll see is quite different when we get to the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit, which is also free. It's created for UK farmers by UK farmers, essentially. It's a really fantastic resource, and the website itself is great. It's got a huge number of different options for farmers. It's got all sorts of different emissions reductions, strategies and techniques, and I definitely advise having a little look at that. But this tool measures, the sort of key difference is that this tool measures your entire farm enterprise. So you might have a number of different crops, you might have a tourism business, you might have some renewable energy production, you might have a few livestock. It measures all of it. So you put all of that information in and it gives you a balance for the entire thing. So this is obviously not helpful if you're comparing to other farms, because yours is going to be quite different to other people's. There's going to be huge differences. But if you're doing it year on year and measuring your improvements, it's a really useful way to measure what you're doing right, identify some hotspots. You might look at it and think, right, well, that particular crop has huge emissions, so maybe I want to rethink whether I do it. It's really helpful to get a much fuller picture of what you're working with on your holding. So I'll do a quick kind of intro into how they work. So this slide shows what you would see if you went onto the Cool Farm Tool website. So on the left there, you would click into whatever enterprise you want to measure. So say in this circumstance for my fake farm, I've clicked on beef. You then enter all the information there. So you go, the numbers of livestock, what you're feeding them, where they graze, energy requirements, all of that kind of stuff. And then it will give you your results. The Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit looks a wee bit different, but same kind of concept. Put in all your emissions, all your various emission sources, your livestock, your agrochemicals, waste processes, fuel used, all of that. And then you enter in all the areas where you think, where you're sequestering carbon. So you'd be talking, wetlands, woodlands, hedgerows, soil organic matter, all of that. And then you end up with what sort of looks like that, a balance essentially. So that was my, another fake farm that I'm pretty sure wouldn't even work if it was real life. But you'd end up with something like that you could start looking at and trying to get that balance to zero, if that's what you were aiming for. So what's next? We've got, once you've worked out your emissions, once you've had a play around with some of those tools, you can start thinking about hotspots that you might have and where you might be able to start reducing them. So sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, there's a lot going on outside apparently today. So for livestock, around 60% of emissions associated with beef production are methane, and it's around 70% for sheep. So that's a significant number. But as it's biological process, it can be really difficult to find ways to conclusively reduce these. There's a huge amount of research and development going on in this space. There's a lot of new technology that's being evaluated around methane inhibitors, diet improvements, vaccines, all of that kind of stuff. But the easiest way to make a change is essentially to improve productivity. So this might be through feed efficiency, by adding supplements, changing forage mix. High sugar diets, for example, have been shown to reduce methane emissions. And the other big way is by reducing animal health and welfare across all livestock, pork, poultry included, to reduce mortality, improve fertility, and increase growth rates. So those make quite big changes. I will mention that in the carbon calculators, it can be quite difficult to accurately establish how much of a difference feed improvements might be making. So it's definitely worth investigating that, but it may not show up in your carbon calculator. But overall productivity improvements definitely do. The other big way that you can reduce the amount of methane and nitrous oxide emissions coming from livestock systems is through covering slurry and manure stores and also applying them efficiently. So applying slurry to fields in spring, for example, can reduce emissions by up to 50%. Injecting or using a trailing tube makes further savings. So that is a really, really important one. Moving to arable, as I mentioned earlier, around 60 to 70% of the emissions associated with arable systems are around production and application of nitrogen-based fertilizers. There are also some carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions through soil cultivation because yeah, a lot of carbon is stored in soils. So for that reason, any reductions in fertilizers and pesticides will make a massive difference. This might be through precision agriculture techniques, just kind of experimentation, benchmarking, using the carbon accounting tools, anything to establish your kind of optimum fertilizer application rate and work towards reducing it. There are over 10 billion tonnes of carbon stored in UK soils, which is equivalent to about 80 years, I think, of total UK emissions. So that's a really significant part of it. We've got a huge amount of carbon stored in our soils, and we really need to be doing everything we can to keep that stored and, where possible, improve it. The Food and Agriculture Organisation estimates there's more carbon in the first metre of soil than there is in the entire atmosphere. So it's huge, and it's a really, really important part of the whole picture. So in an arable system, this will all be, to keep that carbon stored, it'll all be about undertaking practices like min-till, anything that reduces cultivation really, and making sure crops are covered. Using cover crops can make a big difference. This has a number of other benefits related to erosion, water retention, reduces the risk or improves our resilience to flood and drought and things like that. So that's a really big one. Then we've also got, so those that 10% carbon dioxide emissions that I mentioned, there are a number of options to start working towards reducing those. Really all about reducing energy use, increasing energy efficiency, and where possible installing renewable energy systems. So farm buildings, whether they're for domestic buildings or animal housing, things like that, they should all try and be well insulated where possible. Installing renewable systems or AD if there is availability for it on your farm. This will, I think, be an area where landowners and farmers can play a really big role in getting the entire economy to net zero, because we've got the land to be able to install these kind of systems. So this could be small scale, large scale. It might just be solar PV, ground source heat pumps, AD, all of that kind of stuff. And the other big one is farm vehicles. So reducing fuel use and reducing fuel use and just trying to use vehicles as efficiently as possible. So the other big part of the equation is carbon sequestration. So this is about looking at all the areas on your farm where you might be absorbing carbon. Forestry and woodland, large scale, small scale. The Committee on Climate Change wants us to get up to about 17% total tree cover, which will involve planting 30,000 to 50,000 hectares of new woodland every year up to 2050. So it's huge. But for farmers and landowners, it doesn't necessarily mean becoming a forester. It just means finding areas on your land where you might be able to plant a few trees, which links to that third picture there, agroforestry and hedgerows. The Committee on Climate Change wants us to double those. So anywhere that there's an area where you can, plant up hedgerows or engage in kind of, we call it agroforestry, we just really mean trees on farms. It doesn't have to be sort of silvo pasture or silvo arable or anything particularly high tech. It just involves, finding spots, field margins, riparian, buffer strips, that kind of stuff. And soil and peatland, a huge one. I could probably do an entire 25-minute presentation on soil carbon and how important that is. But yeah, finding ways to improve soil organic matter. This can be through testing it, which shows up in the carbon calculators, or even just visually using visual assessments basically to work out what soil carbon, if it's improving. The critical part there is that it does need to be improving for it to show up in calculators. So what is next? I really want you to all go and have a crack at it. Go and have a go, have a play around with the tools, see if there's areas that you can improve. The other big part of it is that it does help if you pick one tool and then stick with it. So whether it's the Cool Farm tool or the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit, you'll get your best results if you stick with it, use the same tool year on year, and then you can monitor your improvements more easily. Have a play around with it and look at different targets, figure out where your hotspots might be, assess what the footprint would look like if you did double your hedgerows or, plant a hectare of woodland or something like that. That can be quite an interesting way to think about different ways to use your land. And also, don't just stop at your farm. We sort of advise that that's what you've got the most control over, and that's what you should put into your carbon calculator. But have a look up and down the supply chain. Try and work with suppliers who also have net zero pledges or who you think are doing sort of good work to reduce their own emissions. And that's a really important part. The other next step for you is to have a look on the CLA website. We've produced a huge number of resources. We've got a landing page for climate change that goes through all of the kind of key points, goes into a lot of detail in a further report that we've produced that you can access there around net zero and climate change and what it all means. And then we've also produced a guidance note on carbon accounting, which runs through a lot of the stuff that I've just discussed today, but in a lot more detail. So I would highly recommend you go to that web address and have a look at all the resources. And in the meantime, I will pass you over to Ed, who is going to talk about a little bit more about what this all means. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alice, for that fascinating insight into the carbon accounting tools available and explaining a little bit about how to interpret the results. My first slide that I've got for you is a few images I collected when preparing for this presentation. And I think that it nicely sums up the current climate change situation. I think it's fair to say that climate change is occurring, and undoubtedly human activities are the main cause. But what is apparent is that attitudes have changed irretrievably in the last 18 months or so. Society is now far more inward looking in its behaviours, and people are doing more to mitigate against their personal contribution. And climate change campaigners haven't been appeased by the simple declaration of a climate change emergency, and they're demanding more action from government. A recent YouGov poll stated that 62% of respondents believed that the UK government is not doing enough to prepare and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And this pressure has meant that governments and corporations around the world are starting to take action. And in this scenario, rural land use is going to be both the hero and the villain, facing enthusiasm and scrutiny in equal measure. As Alice mentioned, UK agriculture contributes about 10% of UK greenhouse gas emissions, as seen on this graph here. And as consumers have become more environmentally conscious, and as Alice said, a number of retailers and brands with dedicated supply chains are requesting some form of carbon account from their suppliers. In addition, in Scotland and Ireland, farmers are incentivized to produce emissions reports to improve their efficiencies. So albeit at present landowners in England are not obligated to complete a carbon audit, it's not unlikely that this won't become a statutory requirement for all businesses. Yet agriculture has got a very important role to play along with other rural land use sectors. It's unique in its ability to both reduce its own emissions, but also increase carbon removals from the atmosphere and contribute to emission reductions in other sectors through the substitution of carbon intensive materials and energy. So I think it's fair to say that there are challenges and opportunities at every turn. Now, the majority of carbon tools that are available are predominantly physical carbon accounting led. They essentially provide a greenhouse gas inventory. And the phrase that one of my former colleagues used to use was, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I think this very much applies. And the use of carbon accounting tools will provide an appropriate benchmark from which we can look to measure progress. I recently completed a carbon audit of a rural business well known to me, and the graph on the screen now provides a summary of the results shown. I think it's fair to say that prior to completing the assessment, I was quite confident that the business in question would have a relatively small carbon footprint. The land equates to just over 300 hectares and although it is largely arable with only a small area of woodland and permanent grass, the business grows an array of spring crops, the majority of which are floral and undoubtedly have significant environmental benefits. And the fact that the business is growing a large area of spring crops, I thought that they would therefore require less inputs than most winter crops such as oilseed rape. But upon completing the assessment, I was a little bit disappointed, I think it's fair to say, that the business was in fact a substantial emitter, producing almost 900 tonnes of carbon equivalent each year, and only sequestering a little over 60 tonnes. So just for perspective, that's about 3 tonnes a hectare being emitted across the whole business. So the figures that are produced, I think it's for those of you that are fairly skeptical about the use of carbon tools, I think it's important to emphasize that yes, the figures are relatively arbitrary and the data is quite granular. However, the information that's provided is sufficient enough, whether focusing on a holding as a whole or a specific product or enterprise, to be able to decipher areas where emissions can be avoided, where emissions can be reduced, and where emissions can be recovered. So if we quickly look back at the business that I mentioned earlier, how might we be able to apply these changes? Well, on a simple avoid, reduce and recover basis, almost half of the emissions on this business were from the use of granular urea fertilizer, 350 tonnes of carbon equivalent of 900 tonnes of carbon equivalent emitted. So the starting point would probably be, could the business use an alternative product or indeed use one with a urease inhibitor? As an alternative, could the business look to make use of green fertilizers such as digestates? These are being used increasingly, but I appreciate that there is limited supply for these. So then moving on to reduce, even a minor adjustment would be beneficial. And as Alice said, if we're doing these calculations annually, we could monitor the progress year on year. So the business may wish to only complete a single pass with their urea application, or they could potentially look to utilize technologies such as variable rate spreading to target where nitrogen uptake will be best utilized. The image that I've got on your screen there just shows a yield map, which might be helpful in terms of deciphering where you might want to apportion more or less fertilizer. And then finally, in regards to recover, this might be using your yield maps to establish areas that are not profitable to farm effectively through arable cropping. And we may wish to consider alternative uses, such as introducing uncultivated areas or margins, or indeed even tree planting. By looking at these, a business can assess areas where it can improve productivity, drive efficiency, and potentially identify new revenue streams, which, with the loss of basic payments, is likely to be very significant. It's well documented that there is likely to be a large funding gap with reduced basic payment support heading towards 2028, and a possible slow introduction of ELMS looking at 2025 for mainstream introduction of these. So using figures from the Farm Business Survey, looking at all farm types and average performance, we've modelled what might be expected. The model assumes 3% growth per annum in farming profits and 3% growth in diversification income, and a 200% in agri-environment schemes from the introduction of ELMS in 2025. I think it's fair to say that with these probably optimistic assumptions, net profit is likely to fall by 25%, by 37%. So the key point is that the introduction of ELMS is unlikely to make up for the loss in basic payments, and therefore it's going to be important that businesses target being in the top 25% of performers, and they continue to grow profits from diversification and from other environmental sources. So what can we do to make up the future farming gap? I think it's fair to say that landowners will need to target the private and public purse. We will no longer be dependent solely on handouts from the Rural Payments Agency. And I've listed two significant opportunities below. The first of which is carbon trading, and in particular targeting blue chip companies. It's something that has made a few waves in the last 18 months. As many of you may be aware, Microsoft recently announced it intended on going carbon neutral, and that it would be offsetting all its carbon emitted from the foundation of the business back in 1975. So clearly this means that Microsoft is going to be in the market to secure some carbon credits to offset their emissions, and that then presents some opportunity. I don't think that we'll be dealing with Bill Gates directly in regards to this, but I think this just shows clearly the shift in mentality from businesses, and exposes the tip of the iceberg in regards to the possibilities for carbon trading. My second opportunity is that of biodiversity offsetting, which is defined in the UK as conservation activities that are designed to give biodiversity gain to compensate for residual losses caused by development. Essentially, it's a policy that seeks to minimise damage to biodiversity and hopes to ensure that where any damage is in place, that it at least is compensated for, but often results in an environmental gain elsewhere. So again, another opportunity for us to be looking at. As a business, Stratton Parker are starting to build up a database of farms that we're completing carbon audits and natural capital assessments for. We are very much at the fledgling stage as an industry in regards to this matter, and it feels like we're on the cusp of a very exciting period. Carbon audits very much appear to me as the prequel to a full natural capital assessment, but can still provide some really useful information for businesses, including where our impacts are on the environment. But most importantly, they provide the information to start thinking about how long-term land use and environmental strategy might need to be adapted. I include a couple of graphs on your screen just showing the baseline and comparator scenario on an estate. The baseline is if the business maintains the current practices as they are currently over the next 60 years, which is likely to cost them £8.9 million. The comparator scenario shows that how this can potentially be turned into a positive over the next 60 years by implementing various changes to their business to optimize their assets. These aren't cost-free exercises, so the 3.8 million, sorry, that indicated would require some expenditure to achieve this. But for all landowners, advisors and trustees, can we safely say that without, if we're planning on making large-scale investment in our farming or estate infrastructure, how can we make decisions without having this sort of information displayed to us? So just to round this presentation off, for those of you unfamiliar with TED Talks, the Golden Circle focuses on the why we do something. Often when we start looking at what is the problem with a specific area, we often start with what is the problem before then progressing on to how can we achieve this. But rarely do we start looking at why we do something. So we know what the causes of climate change are, and we know how we can adapt our business using the avoid, reduce, recover principles. But the most important piece is why we should be preparing our businesses now if it's not a mandatory requirement and the information provided isn't perfect. Climate change is rising rapidly up the government's agenda. It will be increasingly important for landowners in England and Wales to show how they are taking action to reduce emissions and increase carbon sequestration. And carbon accounting is a great way for us to do that. And it's likely to form a major part of our future agricultural policy. So by completing the exercise now, landowners can give themselves a head start and look to make informed decisions about how they can improve productivity, drive efficiency, identify new revenue streams, and hopefully protect the future of their business. The time has come for the industry as a whole to step forward and embrace the prospect of change. So that concludes my presentation. The next speaker is Oliver McIntyre, who I'm sure many of you may already be familiar with. Oliver comes from a farming background and has worked as a farming advisor prior to joining Barclays. Oliver, over to you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. Two really interesting presentations. I am not going to speak for too long, you'll be pleased to hear, and we can get into some of the interesting questions that are coming through. Please do keep typing them in. I said the other day to a friend that 2020 felt like the year that never was. But I think what sort of lockdown and the current scenario has enabled us all to do, perhaps as an industry, is to just pause a little, get a bit more time in our days and our diaries, and get a little more in depth into the world of climate change, carbon sequestration, carbon accounting, and probably just looking forward into the ELM scheme. Because actually, obviously, land management, whether it's production, whether it's progress, just doesn't stop for anything, does it? For us as a bank, we're hugely keen on investigating carbon. I will touch on some of the things that Alice and Ed has already spoken about, but to us, carbon accounting, as one of Ed's last slides showed, it is potential income. And income can't just be measured in sort of checks into a bank account or digital payments into a bank account, I should say, probably. It can be measured in the amount of payments that are actually not leaving a bank account. So anything that involves extra income, a bank is always going to be interested in for their clients. And for me, carbon accounting, yeah, it's a lot about soil management. It's about trees, hedgerows, measuring and looking at that carbon sequestration piece. but it's also, soil carbon is basically soil organic matter, and it's very well known. The higher the organic matter in soil, the greater water holding capacity. So it's mitigating your risk against flood, it's mitigating your risk against drought. To a degree as well, Alice spoke a lot about cover crops and things like that. It's reducing soil erosion through wind blow and rain runoff in heavy rain periods too. So for us as a bank, there's a potential income stream. There is the need to conform to compliance to legislation. But actually, it is about forward thinking. It's about risk management of your crops and your livestock enterprises. And actually, as Ed touched on, carbon loss, in his example of urea fertilizer, is actually inefficiency. And inefficiency is cash lost. Often asked, usually at this time of year, I should be in Built Wells this week, like many people on the line, no doubt. Most discussions usually get asked, what is the biggest risk as a UK agri-banking sector? The top three suggestions we are given are usually land price, commodity price, and probably at the moment sort of negative trade deals that impact or put the UK at a disadvantage. I think for me at the moment, we sit in a world where we as a bank and our high street competitors lend over 5, 10, 15, 20 years and more. But we're in a period of huge change. So for me, probably the biggest risk at the moment is resisting that change. Because as a sector, and I am passionate about agriculture and have a huge farming background, as a sector, we really need to engage with this. And by definition, everybody who's dialed in and tuned in today is engaged with it and wants to find out more. But I totally agree with Alice that we need to lead and own these messages, because actually, I've said it before on one or two of these webinars, we're getting pushed and cajoled down a road by an awful lot of groups, but we must remember, and we must get that argument out there, that actually food is not optional as a way of life. Cars, flights, holidays, all the things we all enjoy, which are really important for our sort of peace of mind and our relaxation, they are actually optional. Food, we just can't get by without. Our belief at Barclays Agriculture is that carbon accounting can and will be a viable and solid income stream. I do believe that carbon sequestration and the sale of carbon should probably be left to the commercial markets rather than be forming part of ELMS, because I think that the capability to earn income from that way is far better for the industry. And what we've got to remember is that, climate change, carbon, greenhouse gas emissions is not going away. And the industry just needs to engage with it. It needs to embrace it. And then when it suits a farming enterprise and when you can see that sort of extra margin and extra efficiency in, embed it within that farming business or that land management. Overall, I think if I had one wish for 2020, it would be that agriculture is seen as part of the solution to the jigsaw that is going to be combating climate change. With that, I will hand back over to Kath, and I think we're going to do some Q&As, Kath, aren't we?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver, and thanks to all the presenters. Can I ask all the presenters to turn on their videos and their mics so that we can speak to everyone? We've got lots of questions come in, so please do keep them coming. There's quite a few questions on soil and carbon levels in soil. So I think I'll start with Ed on question saying, how do you calculate the carbon levels of soil? But alongside this, and Alice might want to add something, we've got a question, has there been any guidance on the measurement of soil organic matter and soil carbon, as this is so important within the online carbon calculators? You can radically alter the net position of a farm by making relatively small increases in soil organic matter. I suggest that without an accountable, repeatable soil sampling regime, then we can't quantify and then monetize increased soil health and sequestration.
So if I'll sort of answer the first part of the question and then sort of build on from that. Alice, feel free to interject or carry on from my sort of direction of travel. essentially there are several methods that can be used for measuring soil organic carbon, but the most commonly used is the loss on ignition test. But you can find a sort of any sort of general soil sample that you take. You can request an organic matter test within that. I think the point that you make is perfectly that is made, and the question is perfectly valid. There is a huge amount of variability in soil organic matter. You only need to dig in a soil 1 foot away, and you probably will find some variation in soil organic matter, and therefore how that is realized in terms of value, I think remains a little bit unclear. Certainly at the outset of sort of investigating this area, I was under the impression that farmers and estate owners may potentially be looking at businesses and looking to guarantee improvements in soil organic matter over a period of time, which would help sequester more carbon. I'm not quite sure how that truthfully works in practice because of the variability. But I think that by going out and assessing your soils, you're giving yourself the very best indication as to what the levels are within your soils currently, and by looking to implement various changes in terms of management practice, you can certainly drive efficiency by optimizing your soils, by improving the sort of inherent fertility of the soil. And that may result in a reduction in inputs on the land. So it may only result in a reduction in the carbon emissions of the farming business itself. It may not manifest itself in a capture-like scenario, which can be monetized. But Alice, I will pass it on to you to see whether or not you have a differing view, or whether you hold similar views to me.
No, I think you've nailed it, actually, Ed. I think that's explained it really well. It's soil health and soil carbon is a big part of government policy now on climate change and land use. So I think it's been included in the agriculture bill, and we know that with the new environmental land management scheme, climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation are both public goods that are going to be paid for, and along with a bunch of others like water quality and flood prevention and all that kind of stuff, which soil health all impacts. So we know that it's going to be part of policy. How that kind of works, I guess, is yet to be seen, because it is something that government and the CLA are kind of grappling with, is how you can get accurate measurements to then influence payments. But we do know that activities make a big difference, so maybe that's how they'll do it. But yeah, when it comes to accurately measuring it, it's not as easy. It's not particularly easy, and the calculators do help in some respect, but you do have to have a rough idea to start with. And again, I think I said it in the presentation, it is all about measuring improvements that you make, so that you're measuring the actual carbon that's being sequestered. It's difficult to, you're not necessarily counting what is already stored, which again is another part of the picture. So it's a complicated area, but it's really important that we do a lot of policy thinking around it.
Alice, someone has asked if you can provide a link or suggestions on the visual assessment of soil carbon that you referred to.
Yeah, we've got the guidance note that we produced, the CLA produced, has a bit of information about that, but the AHDB has done some work on it. They've got some guidance on it, and also SRUC, I can't remember what it stands for, Scotland's Rural College, I think. They've produced a really fantastic guide about visual assessments. You obviously can't accurately measure soil organic matter or soil carbon from a visual assessment, but it will give you an idea where on your farm you might have healthier soils. And if you're measuring year on year and taking lots of photos and stuff, you can start to measure improvements, which again is where the big difference is made, is in those improvements.
I think Alice is happy to talk to anyone if you'd like to contact her after the session.
Yeah.
Alice, you talked about improvements. We've got a question here. Should we plough up grassland now with the expectation that we can then be paid to green it back via carbon credits or biodiversity offsetting. I accept that this would do more environmental harm in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, no is the answer to that. But the government is considering this because it is a problem that I think has happened in the past with when new schemes are kind of in their infancy. People tend to wait to see what the scheme will offer before. For tree planting, for example, we sort of know that there's going to be a lot of money coming up in trees. And so people are saying, well, why bother planting trees now when we could wait and maybe get more money for it if we do it further down the track? But the government has sort of taken all this into consideration when they're pulling together their policy programs and looking at the environmental land management scheme in England and the sustainable land management scheme in Wales. So I don't think that that's necessarily the right way to go about it.
Yeah, and it's something that we at the CLA have been pushing for, that commitment that anyone who makes improvements now will not be disadvantaged in any future scheme. So for all the panellists, I think we'll start with Oliver here. What does the panel see as the benefits of the UK going to net zero whilst the rest of the world are not? Dieter Helm expressed concern that we're just moving our carbon usage to other countries when addressing a session yesterday.
Yeah, unfortunately I missed that session. I was on another one. What are the advantages? You know, there is that phrase, and I think I've used it, probably stolen from someone else, but you know, if we import food, we're exporting environmental responsibility. We have no control over their production methods or anything. I think, you know, we must always bear in mind that, you know, a quarter or maybe a third of the UK is struggling sometimes to get from one week to another, feeding their children, feeding their family, and all the rest of it. However, there is a huge proportion of the UK that is slightly more affluent, and for me, one of the biggest advantages of being net zero, and actually the race to get there, will be from a marketing point of view. I have a sneaking suspicion that on the mean streets and affluent areas of a lot of cities, if you've got a choice of having a carbon neutral burger or a carbon neutral steak, or you can have one that isn't got that claim, but you've got to pay 10, 20, 25% more for it. I've got a sneaky suspicion, a bit like offsetting your air miles when you book a flight, there will be a large proportion of the UK that are prepared to do that. What we've also got to bear in mind is, you know, we're constantly trying to encourage people to buy British, to support British produce, British agriculture, and clearly we can never be 100% self-sufficient in the UK, given the diversity of foods we like to eat these days. But there is, you know, we must think, and it goes back to sort of leading the message and controlling the debate more, that actually, you know, getting to net zero in UK agriculture would be a huge plus for the sort of brand and presence of UK agriculture and its produce around the world, as well as just in the UK.
Ed, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to follow on in terms of the importance of sort of meeting the net zero challenge. I think that we shouldn't use the excuse that because other countries aren't following suit, that it's not an important thing to do. I'm sure that we can all think of hundreds of examples of things where we know it's not necessarily the right thing to do, and therefore I think that you know, as an industry, we want to target ourselves to be leaders. You know, we pride ourselves on the standards of how food is produced. I mean, I was personally pretty horrified a few years ago to learn about the prospect of our red tractor standards having to be reduced to fall in alignment with European standards. And I see that this is no different. We have a huge opportunity to lead the way in regards to this. I'm sure people will be saying, well, some other countries are doing even more than we are. And there's certainly a marketing element to that. But ultimately, the agenda, the government agenda is now set for us within the UK for the next few years in regards to attitudes towards the environment. And therefore, I think that we need to be embracing that and identifying opportunities, because the old gravy train that was payment by area is going, and we need to be prepared to take that on board.
I've got a question here. Do you see UK farmers being captured by mandatory carbon reporting requirements with mandatory emissions reductions? Alice?
That's a really interesting question, because they're going through a very similar process at the moment in New Zealand, where they've proposed making farmers pay into the emissions trading scheme, essentially. So they will have to pay for their emissions, their methane emissions, their nitrous oxide emissions, and their carbon emissions, which is obviously going to completely transform the industry and be really difficult for a lot of farmers. To do, and they've gone through a huge amount of kind of thinking behind this, and in the end they've said, right, well, actually we're giving the agriculture industry 5 years to come up with their own way of doing things, and if they can find a way to reduce emissions without entering the emissions trading scheme, we won't make them do it. So I think that the industry bodies are currently in a bit of a flat trying to figure that all out. At the moment, it's not mandatory for farmers and landowners and land managers to report or pay for emissions or anything like that. I'm not necessarily thinking that it will be any time in the near future, but I do think that carbon accounting might become a requirement. There might be it's obviously already been required throughout the supply chain, but there might be an obligation through some of the future agriculture policy schemes to require some form of measurement, and whether or not measurement and then reporting, whether or not that then becomes a kind of carbon tax or something. I do doubt it, but either way, that's sort of where what Ed was explaining. This is why it's really important to start thinking about carbon accounting and thinking about emissions reductions, because the measurement of it will probably be a critical part of government policy.
Is there a risk of double counting? For instance, a farm tenant and landlord submitting a return for the same farm. Ed, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I think I would suggest when you're looking to complete on a carbon calculator, carbon tool online, that you generally would look to only include land that is within your management control. So anything that would be tenanted out wouldn't necessarily be something that would be considered on this, but I would agree that there is a bit of a grey area in regards to this, and that there is a potential for double counting. And I think that that's probably why I personally see these tools as a good opportunity for just general housekeeping. The natural capital assessment that we completed on an estate in North Yorkshire, that encompassed absolutely everything within the estate, but the results were shared with everybody, the tenants included. And I think maybe that collaborative approach is perhaps what we will need to see if you're planning on making changes to your business, or you're planning on capitalizing the carbon assets.
We've got a few questions about ensuring consistency of approach. So a question here from Tom Stratton. Clearly carbon accounting will have increasing relevance as a means of both guiding managers in achieving reduced carbon output, but also demonstrating to the marketplace the carbon footprint of specific products. The ALM scheme is also likely to recognise management in this area. Are you aware of any work underway nationally to ensure we have consistency of approach in assessing both carbon emitted and sequestered? Alice, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I would just make the point that that's a really, really valid concern, and that's a really big lobbying point for the CLA, is that we need consistency, and if anything is going to be involved in agricultural policy, paid for, or consistently measured across the country, we need one tool to do it that everyone can use, and that comes out with as accurate as possible results, because that is a big issue. You can put you can use different calculators and get wildly different results. As I explained with the Cool Farm tool and the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit, they don't actually measure necessarily the same thing, because one's doing your whole farm and one's doing your product. So this is a really critical part of it, and we're lobbying really hard for one standardised method of accounting.
A question for Ed here. Looking at your chart on carbon sequestering, taking the baseline scenario to comparator scenario, the improvements appear to be entirely driven from the arable sector. Do you think there's an opportunity for much more mixed farming to manage sequestration and efficiency?
In short, yes. I think we're already seeing, without the incentive of carbon credits for farmers to investigate a more traditional farming system, in regards to the baseline and comparator scenario, I didn't cover much detail in regards to what the actual report encompassed. Within the report, there was a significant area that was recommended for tree planting, and there was a sizable dairy unit that was included within the assessment, but the dairy was tenanted out. So it was something that clearly would require fairly sizable restructuring within the business in order for that to have been amended or changed. So therefore, I think it was a bit of a case, for want of a better expression, of just picking the slightly low-hanging fruit as to how they could improve their business.
Great, thanks all. We have got a lot more questions, but I think we're going to have to finish it there because we've already gone over. If anyone would like to continue talking about this topic, please do contact your CLA regional office, and Alice is happy to chat to anyone. Also, please remember we have a guidance note on carbon accounting on the CLA website, and we also have a the net zero pages, which is really interesting report. There's lots of infographics on there, which useful in terms of looking, to be able to chat down the pub and explain the nuances and intricacies of climate change and farming in particular. This is the last of our summer series of webinars, and they will start again on the 2nd of September. So look out for that invite. Thank you again to our series sponsors, Stratton Parker and Barclays. And thank you everyone for joining. Please remember that all of the past webinars are available as recordings, so do have a look at the CLA website to find those. Thank you.